It starts with an idea that what we have done is not working, but that doesn't mean the church has to end. It means that we have to change what we do.
Hi, I'm Carl Vaders, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry, and to our multi-episode series based on the content of my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. My guest in this episode is Bob Smietana. He's a columnist for Religion News Service, and he's the author of Reorganized Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters. Bob is one of the authors that I quote in Desizing the Church from both his book and his articles. In this conversation, we talk about how the church growth movement created larger churches, which created larger dangers. Then we'll talk about what some of those dangers are and what we can do about it. We'll also chat a bit about his fascinating article, There's a Reason Every Hit Worship Song Sounds the Same. Why is that the case, and what does it say about the current church culture? And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with a few talking points, and I'll let you know who I'll be interviewing in next week's Desizing the Church podcast. Bob, welcome to the Church Lobby. I sure appreciate you being with us today very, very much. You have written a book called Reorganized Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters. I quote it in my book, Desizing the Church, and I quote a couple articles that you wrote in 2023 as well. And I want to talk about them with you today.
Sounds good. I feel like I've known you forever.
I feel like, we've spent some time chatting about this already, but just to let everybody in on the secret, we had partway through this conversation and I realized I hadn't recorded yet. Never done that before, did it today, did it to Bob. So here we go.
And that's okay. We're having a good time.
Yeah. Again, in your book, Reorganized Religion, you start out with a couple of statements that I think really define where you go in it really well. So let me read them for everybody. First of all, on page 9, you say, American religion is in a time of unprecedented transformation. And then you kind of define some of the parameters or how that transformation appears in our lives in page 14, when you say America's grandparents go to church, their grandkids do not. So what is the unprecedented transformation and why are the grandkids not going even though their grandparents did?
Sure. Let me explain it this way. We're at the end of a boom in church going. And so often the way I explain this is if I go out and talk to somebody, like a group of people, I will often show them a picture of myself holding my granddaughter, who's 1 year old now. And it's usually a picture of her when she was a month old. And I point out that in 1965, when I was born, Americans were 85% white. Almost everyone was Christian. The nuclear family is the center of life. The men are in charge. And going to church is what good people do. And my granddaughter, who's now 1 year old, in her peer group, there's no ethnic majority. So she's born into a multicultural, multi-ethnic, pluralistic, egalitarian country that's increasingly LGBT affirming, and where the largest segment of the religious landscape are people called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who have no religious affiliation. And almost every religious group in America, an institution, was built for that first world, and none of them are built for the second world. So we've had demographic change, we've had sociological change, we've had political change, we've had technological change. We've had all these outside forces, which has changed the religious landscape. There's probably a number that you're probably aware of, that the average congregation in America 20 years ago was 130 people. And the average congregation, this is the median congregation. So half the congregations are this size or above, half of this size or above, is 60 people. That's dropped in half. And the number of people who identify as religious or Christian has declined. We're in this very large, ongoing decline of American Christianity, religion in general, and because Christianity is the biggest part of American religion and Christianity, that shows no sign of abating, mostly because of demographics and the loss of interest in religion.
Book, The Great De-Churching, with which both you and I are familiar with, they say this is the biggest religious demographic shift in American history. It's towards the negative. It's towards people leaving congregations and not them coming in. This is bigger than the Great Awakenings. This is bigger than Billy Graham crusades that where people came in. They are now leaving at a faster pace than they ever came in.
Yes. One way to understand this is just the math doesn't work. So if you want to build a church or a religious institution that's sustainable, you do a couple things. You practice your faith, you pass it on to your kids, and you invite new people to join in so that they can pass it on to their kids and practice their faith. And what happened in America is people started having fewer kids, and fewer of those kids embraced the religion of their parents. So if you have more funerals than baptisms, infant baptisms, you have more people going out the door than coming in, you're going to be declined. It's math. And the Pew Research Center has a study they projected out to 2070 where they see that the percentage of Christians, about 2/3 of America say they're Christians now. It will probably be somewhere between a half and a third by 2070. And there's no mathematical formula by which Christianity revived in America. This is what the Pew Research report says. So it's a significant change, both in the number of people involved, but also in the place that religion has in American culture.
For those who live in places like I do, like in California or Pacific Northwest or in New England, we have been post-Christian for a while. So we're not happy with that, but we're more used to it, and we've had to figure out ways to adapt to it. Whereas our friends who live in the Bible Belt, this is hitting you for the first time, and it's more than a little bit jarring. Mm-hmm. And there's a tendency, instead of acknowledging it and dealing with it, either to one, deny it, or two, push back against it rather than trying to figure out how to do ministry within it.
I don't know if you run into this, but I have heard a lot of talk about cultural Christianity. I've heard church leaders say, well, isn't this great that all the not real Christians are leaving and there'll just be the true believers left? I think two things. One, that misunderstands how people experience Christianity or any other faith. It goes in waves, right? Sometimes you're really involved, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're full of faith, sometimes you're not. So the other part that's important is that almost every religious institution in America relied on cultural Christianity, right? It was the water in which people drank. It's what built these colleges. I saw a professor who had taught at a big Christian university, one of the biggest in the country. It's a big Baptist university in Texas. You might be able to guess its name, saying, isn't it great all cultural Christians are gone? And I thought to myself, you are at an institution which was built with the money of cultural Christians and sustained by this. To say that it's great, that means your institution and all kinds of other ones are going to disappear. This is a big problem. It's not just now we'll have a pure or smaller faith. It's a larger institution, larger problem in American life.
I think it also denies the fact that I'm a cultural Christian. I'm also a genuine Christian. I am as well. I live in a Christian culture idea. I do things in a Christian way that are common to other Christians. My faith is genuine as well. But being a cultural Christian doesn't mean you aren't genuine as well. There are some who are just cultural. But if we make these broad brush assumptions, I think we're going to miss a lot of what's actually happening here. In fact, one of the things you do real well in your book is you talk about how for many years, in fact, for a generation or more, we saw the decline in population and attendance in mainline congregations, and those that were in conservative congregations were surging. And so, as you put it, I'll actually quote you from page 25 and 26 from Reorganized Religion. You say, at first, theology was used to explain the decline. Those mainline churches had embraced more progressive views of Christianity. Conservative groups, on the other hand, seemed to be growing. So for a while, those of us in conservative Christian circles, we developed an arrogance over this and a sense of inevitability over this. Well, we've just got better theology. That's why they're coming. And as long as we keep preaching a better theology, they will keep coming. And now we're beginning to discover that isn't necessarily so. And for a while, that was even trussed up by the new methods and techniques that we were discovering in the church growth movement. And none of these support structures seem to be holding anymore. So we're in a totally different, well, we're not in a totally different world, but maybe we're becoming more aware of the world we're in now. Is that more accurate?
Yeah, I mean, several things happen. One is that the birth rates among conservative religious people, which are higher than mainline people, have caught up. So that's one thing that slowed down. Other things that slowed down mainline churches, birth rates were one, retention was a second, And then lack of ethnic diversity. So you had shrinking white population, shrinking number of kids, and then you didn't bring any new people in. And you didn't build any churches. So you have lots of churches in places where people used to live, not a lot of places in new communities where people live. So the more evangelical conservative groups were able to hedge their decline a little bit because they had more kids for a while. Now they have as few kids as mainliners. They became more ethnically diverse. They built new churches, but now the decline has caught up to them. So Southern Baptist Convention, for example, is a great example of this. Peaked at 16 million people. They lost 3.5 million people in the last 15 years. They're in a precipitous decline now.
Right.
They have longer to fall because they're bigger. They're experiencing the same decline that large mainline denominations did, and that the math no longer works for them.
Yeah. Most of us have probably seen those charts where they're showing the decline in most denominations. I think the only groups of churches that are not in a significant decline now are the Assemblies of God and kind of the independent churches. There are some of them that aren't.
Yeah, non-denominationals. Yeah.
Yeah, the non-denoms and the Assemblies of God. And I think my guess would be with the non-denoms, because that's where more entrepreneurial folks go, perhaps. And with the Assemblies of God, I think you've probably got two things. One, there is an inherent built-in participatory aspect to those who are Pentecostal. So it's less sit and watch. Pentecostalism requires your participation. And secondly, the Assemblies of God has been extreme about being multi-ethnic since its founding over 100 years ago.
Yeah, diversity in Pentecostalism will keep it growing.
Yeah, and I am Assemblies of God background, so that now is our big triumphant statement, but I wonder how long that's going to hold, just like the triumphant statement of we have a better theology was for most
Pentecostalism is still
churches.
Pretty booming, but even the Catholic Church, right? Diversity has saved the Catholic Church from, it has not seen precipitous decline because of the large number of Hispanic immigrants. That's the only thing that saved them. The white Catholic Church is much smaller, but there is enough immigration to keep the Catholic Church afloat.
Yeah.
It's actually affecting Pentecostals as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Everybody's feeling this right now. That's for sure. Yeah. Let's get now into some of the places where I quote you in my book.
Okay.
I've got two chapters in a row, one entitled What the Church Growth Movement Got Right. And I didn't put that in there just to, appease people. I really do believe there are some really, really good things that happened that the church growth movement helped us with, were a blessing for, and I outlined them in that chapter. That, however, is not the chapter where I quote you.
Okay.
The quotes that I draw from you happen to be for the following chapter, which is where the church growth movement went sideways. So I want to pause for a moment to let all my listeners know, for the next little bit, we are going to talk about some of the unintended negative consequences of the church growth movement. I don't want you to get, 5 to 10 minutes into here and go, all they're doing is putting down the church growth movement. No, this is just this one section of the book. It is balanced out with the good stuff. But the church growth movement has been around long enough now, 40 plus years, where we can, I think, have some objectivity about its unintended negative consequences. That's where we want to go. So in one of my subheadings in the chapter entitled, The Church Growth Movement Created Larger Churches, Which Created Larger Dangers, I quote you from your book where you write this: a fallen small church pastor is a problem. A fallen megachurch pastor is a disaster. Why is it a disaster in the megachurch more so than in the small church?
Just one is the scope, because if you have a church, say, of 60 people, and the pastor falls, that affects 60 people. If you have a church of 600, that's like 10 small churches. You have a church of 6,000, then you have 100 churches failing. So there's just a larger, and those larger congregations often have a bigger network of people. So the fall is farther. So we put concentrated people at very large churches. Most of the power in those churches is concentrated in the leadership, and they're very weak. So it's actually a very weak institution, and all the pressure goes on that minister. Well, if that minister fails, the whole thing falls apart, and they can be very weak institutions that way.
Sadly, is not theoretical. I mean, we could, I won't, but how many names could we list off over the last few years of churches that seemed invulnerable, but the fall of one person put them into major crisis and serious downsizing, and some of them have disappeared altogether because far more of it was resting on the shoulders of that one person's leadership talents, charisma, creativity, drive, whatever it was. And when that piece is taken out, the rest of it can't seem to sustain.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you add internet and you add the chance to broadcast your message out, it's not just the 6,000 people in the room. It can literally be millions of people who are seriously negatively impacted by a single person's moral failure.
Yeah. I don't know if in the book, do you talk about the homogeneous unit principle?
I do.
Because that is one of the things that having the homogeneous unit principle, which means you just get people who are alike and you put them in the same church. And that's going to attract large groups of people, which works. One problem for that in American culture is one, we became more sorted. It's not just where you live, but it's people want to live. There's something called a big sort, which we have sorted and moved into places where we only want to be with people who look like us, vote like us, think like us, and buy the same things we do. So the homogenous units have become much bigger and much more political and much more social. And they have become, one byproduct of that is the hostility towards people who are outside. I don't think the folks who thought of the homogenous unit principle thought about the hostility to outsider and in-group, out-group dynamics, which are so much part of American life. So you have churches that are not everyone is alike, but they either intentionally or unintentionally send messages about who is not welcome.
Yeah.
And it's often based on race and money and politics.
Yeah, what's fascinating about that is I did a study into the church growth movement, starting with Donald McGavran, who actually coined the term church growth and is considered by everybody to be the founder of that. And he coined the term homogeneous unit principle. But here's what I discovered, which is really fascinating. The homogeneous unit principle, as defined by McGavran when he was a missionary in India, came because he was living in India where there was a caste system.
Yeah.
And what he discovered was if you go in as an American, or if you have one person in one caste who gives their life to Christ, they don't have the ability to speak to the caste above them. And if they speak to the caste below them, the person in the caste below them thinks that if I become a Christian like them, that means I have to adapt out of my caste. So his idea was we need to teach people how to evangelize within their caste and across caste systems for them to understand that you can become a Christian without denying the entire culture that you grew up in. So in fact, when he created the term and adapted the principle, it was actually anti-racist and something that helped people cross caste lines. Part of his concern, and again, I outlined this in the book, Desizing the Church, part of McGavran's concern was that if this idea comes to America, Americans have a completely different, like a 180-degree different look at these issues, that we would turn it into the sorting that you talked about, which is exactly what happened. So it's fascinating that a principle that started out as trying to be cross-cultural and anti-racist became exactly the opposite of that. Yeah, so I laid that out in Desizing the Church too. So that's something that I found was fascinating, and I hope I lay it out well for you in Desizing the Church.
Yeah.
And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to carlvaders.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. Let's move along. Continuing to quote you from a book, you also cite the work of Mark Chavez from Duke Divinity School. Rather than the growth of megachurches being a sign of religious vitality, Chavez suspects that it is another sign that organized religion is on the decline. This is part of a segment where I explain that demographically, big churches tend not to proliferate primarily where Christians are growing as a percentage of the population. Big churches tend to happen where Christians have money. In the places in the world where Christians are growing as a percentage of the population, it's usually because of the multiplication of healthy smaller congregations, not the building of larger ones. And Chavez's research, as you quoted in there, is, I think, part of the proof of that.
Yeah. No, and part of it is those big churches, when you join a big church, you give less, you go less, you participate less. And part of the ways that the church is structured is that the people, their role is to carry out the plan of leaders, which can be effective, but it also tells people that they're not owners, they're not part of the decision-making process, that the church really is. They're followers in a way that they have things don't depend on them. So if things go badly, they don't come in, and they're not needed anymore. And so that if you tell people you're not needed and their input's not wanted, they'll get that message.
And that's the way I try to put it when I talk to pastors is I say, if you are a Christian and you decide you want to be an anonymous observer, what size of church are you going to pick? Well, you're going to pick a big church because it's easier to be an anonymous observer. It doesn't mean that you're inevitably an anonymous observer. I know a lot of people who go to big churches and who are very involved and are growing in their faith. On the other hand, if you're a control freak, you're going to pick a small church. So the big church pastor has to fight against anonymity and passivity, and the small church pastor has to fight against the control freaks. We each have our dark sides that we've got to deal with.
And if you look at a big church, this is probably there are a number of things going on here. One thing that's happened in American culture is that we trust institutions less and we join them less. So we participate less in general. So going to church is one more thing that people don't do. And joining is one more thing that people don't do. But along with that, this is a little bit complicated. Large churches because they're large, have driven the staff-driven model, right? Staff is in charge, congregation carries out this. This is in Protestant circles. That's coincided with the growth of the elder model, where the elders, instead of congregational governments, you have an elder government. It's really a staff with ecclesiological titles, right? With spiritual titles. One thing's the downside is that it's really led to the decline of congregationalism. And so people do not know how to belong to each other anymore. Right? I had this wonderful experience. It wasn't wonderful, but really interesting insight when talking to a Unitarian pastor on Martha's Vineyard. We were talking about a different story. She was doing a series called Baseball, Belonging, and Barbecue, which sounds like a lot of fun, right? I go, what is that about? Well, she says, my congregation people don't know how to belong to each other. Unless I give them everything they want, they'll leave. And the minute we disagree, people leave. This is Unitarians, right? They have an inclusive. No, this is a problem for everyone in American life. We don't know how to belong to each other. We've lost all the soft skills of reaching consensus, of talking through things to each other. Church meetings are not efficient, but they do involve compromise and discussion and working through problems and then going have dinner together. There's a kind of set of soft skills that we learn in participatory church governance that are lost. So churches is one of the places people learn participatory governance. We also lost that in institutions. We lost that in our town governments. We lost that. Nobody runs nonprofits anymore. So we lost all those soft skills that allow people to make decisions, difficult decisions together and work through them. This is an unintended consequences of being larger and more efficient and being more top-down. Because, the downside of meeting is that the last person on the mic and the most persuasive argument wins. But persuading people and building consensus is a super helpful skill that we don't have anymore. That's maybe off topic, but it really, I think, affects us.
Yeah, no, it's completely on topic. When I was a kid, the baby boomer generation, I'm a late boomer.
Yeah.
The baby boomer generation literally invented one size fits all.
Mm-hmm.
So in my parents' generation, a parent in Georgia and a parent in New York and a parent in California were preparing very different meals for their family for the evening meal because it was regional. And then the boomers came along. We literally invented one size fits all and celebrated one size fits all. And for the first time in history, the parent in New York, the parent in Florida, and the parent in California are preparing exactly the same mac and cheese out of exactly the same blue and yellow box for their kids.
Yep.
And we then applied this to everything, including our church institutions.
Mm-hmm.
There was a great familiarity. And when it first came in, we celebrated it because this then dropped the unit price for everything.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you could buy high quality clothes off the rack instead of having to go to a tailor and pay a ton of money or get it sewn at home by mom.
Mhm.
And almost everything seemed to get better for a while. But then what it also did is it flattened everything and made it much more generic. We lost the personal touch. We lost the regional flavors, which leads me now
Yes.
to the
There we
first
go.
of two articles that you wrote in 2023. The first one in April 2023 that you wrote for Religion News Service was entitled, "There's a Reason Every Hit Worship Song Sounds the Same." And this is one of what I have under a subheading in that chapter that I wrote. And the subheading I entitled, "The Church Growth Movement Contributed to the Megachurch Variety Problem."
Yeah.
And there's a reason why, if I'm traveling and I'm speaking at conferences and I know the next conference is going to be held in a megachurch, I have a picture in my head of what's going to happen, and it happens that way every single time. But if I look at my schedule and I'm going to be appearing at a smaller church, and that's where the conference is going to be held, flip a coin, baby. You have no idea what you're going to get.
Yeah.
So you laid this out in a very colorful way in actually this series. So the first one, let's talk about that before we get to the second one. Why does every hit worship song sound the same?
That's a great question. So there's a study called the Worship Leader Research Project, which is a number of people who study worship music are looking at these kind of trends. We look at the kind of commodification of religious church music and the kind of way that four churches really have dominated them. And it's a Pentecostal kind of style of music. One thing we don't know is that whether these folks are just collaborations of really good songwriters who know what fits the market right now. That's part of it. But they've also kind of owned the distribution system. So that even if they didn't write the song, they just distribute it right. They just have this clout that no one else has. And so they all sound the same because they're all being produced in the same way from a very small number of churches. It's really fascinating to look at.
What I've noticed is it was 20, 25 years or so ago, we went through a span of time, 10 to 15 years or so, where the complaint that I got from most pastors was, "Oh, we sing these songs in my church, but if I go to another church, they're singing songs I've never heard of before. And then I go to our denominational conference and I don't know any of those," because when the worship music trend started coming in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was coming in from all over the place. There wasn't a unity, and there was a concern that we weren't all singing the same songs. And so we didn't have this common cultural language. And then it all came very much together to where, as you say now in your article, there are four mega churches from which something like 90% of our songs come from. The good is, if I travel and I go to a different place, especially if it's a mid-sized to larger church, I'm more likely to be familiar with the songs and able to sing along. The downside is we lose some of that variety and some of that region.
No, it's interesting because you can go to all kinds of different churches. I mean, it's the one thing that does, on the upside, you could say it's the one thing that holds Christian people in America together is the songs, because like Elevation is a big Southern Baptist. Well, it used to be Southern Baptist, now ex-Southern Baptist church, Pentecostal leaning, prosperity gospel leaning. I was in a church that is very kind of high church and a very completely denomination, which would look with disdain upon prosperity gospel, and they're singing an Elevation song. And with a piano and a violin, and a choir, they're still singing the same song. It's really fascinating. It's a certain kind of experience of worship. So that's a good thing. And it has Pentecostalized our worship and remove some of the teaching part of worship, right? So some of those songs are about teaching doctrine, teaching about ideas. These are almost all about experience. So you get one kind of song, but they are familiar. The other thing that's happened in this is that because those churches are also music content producers, they have to produce a lot of content. So the speed in which a worship song now, because of distribution, can become the most popular has reduced, right? It can become sped up. I can become a popular song in a couple weeks, but they don't have any legs.
Exactly.
They don't build organically, so they may not have legs to stay very long.
And in fact, the
Yeah,
more popular it is, the more we seem to get exhausted with it quickly. Like
yeah,
Waymaker was everywhere for a while. And then all of a sudden, like everybody's sick of Waymaker because it was sung so much. It hit so hard, but then it dropped off so fast. Now, the
yeah,
other side of that, so in April of 2023, you wrote this article about every song sounding the same, but then you wrote an article from the alternative side in July of 2023, where you interviewed Will Bishop from SBTS in Louisville, Kentucky. And he agreed about the flattening trend, but he also did some surveys from smaller churches. And his study found that, as you put it, smaller churches are like the Wild West musically,
yeah,
where anything goes. So let's talk about that. So a lot of this is the big church, small church difference.
yeah.
What's happening in the smaller churches with that Wild West mentality?
Well, that's a whole number of things. The Bishop story survey is a little smaller. They're not quite apples to apples, but yeah, there are just much more variety in the kinds of songs that get sung in those smaller churches because they can have a little bit more of their own identity of congregations. And so there were some hymns were ones that sort of stuck with people, but the rest is, yeah, it's a wider variety in those smaller churches. So they've escaped. Some of it is because they can't do the megachurch stuff. And some of it is just because, so some of it is style, some of it is the talent in the church, and some of it is they're familiar, they might be stuck in singing the same songs, but it's from a different time.
Yeah. One of the things I've also discovered is what you're saying, like you said, his study isn't as wide, isn't as deep and as
Yeah.
wide, but it matches anecdotally with what I
Yes.
experienced spending a lot of time in small churches. It registers with my real experience.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And so it needs to be paid attention to. But what I've also noticed is a lot of this is geographically based.
Yes.
One of the chapters in Desizing the Church that I wrote is about the rise of the suburbs and how the rise of the suburbs has affected the kinds of churches we build, the size of churches we build, the manner in which we do church. People are, for about a 40-year span, when people were leaving rural communities to go to the suburbs, and even more so leaving the inner city to go to the suburbs. First of all, the people who were making that migration were people who could afford to make that migration.
Yes.
And so they typically left those who are poor economically, and that typically meant those who were of ethnic minorities. They tended to leave them behind in the rural communities in the inner cities, which further divided us along racial and socioeconomic lines. And then the churches that were open for these people who were more mobile because they had more money were the kinds of churches that suited people who were more mobile and had more
Yes.
money. And so now we don't have the variety within our churches. And some of that I think was done intentionally with the whole who's your target market and you
Yeah.
should reach
Yes.
it. And some of it I think happened as an unintended consequence. But talk about some of that. It's not just the flattening of the songs we're singing, but it really is the organizing of us into these clumps, these silos ethnically and socioeconomically
Yeah.
that is not healthy for the future of the church.
Yeah. The church has become one more place that we are sorted into people who think the same and look the same and have the same level of income and have all the same issues, right? And those churches, as we talked earlier, homogenous unit principles, that group of people have a dislike of anyone who's not like them. And so people who are not like them, one, they don't make as much money, they come in, they don't welcome. They can find out very quickly they are not welcome politically or sociologically or ethnically. So we've lost the kind of cross-cutting thing, and we have become as siloed as every other part of American culture. So if you look at American culture, one of the myths of the way religion works in America is that the more education you have, the less religious you are. It's actually not true. More religious people, especially people with college degrees, are more religious. They go to church more, for example, than people who don't have college degrees. And so it's become a luxury good, in the same way that marriage has been. So we have lots of folks in America who are disconnected. So when we talk about the nuns, where the NONESs, these are people who have no religious affiliation. They also have no affiliation to anything. And they are part of churches, but they aren't part of anything else. And they know that they're probably not welcome in those churches. So this becomes an issue: is how does a church which is become has become so homogenized have any connection with its community?
Start pushing back against that.
Yeah, yeah. We have seen the growth of multi-ethnic churches. We have seen some other growths, but we also have seen this kind of sorting, especially on political lines, because politics and religion and so many other and consumerism are all tied together. So we can become siloed from each other
Yeah,
and particularly
yeah,
send people messages that they are not welcome, which is unintended. I don't think people want to send those messages, but they
yeah. I
send
agree.
those.
For the most part, obviously, there
Yes.
are always people on either end of the
Oh
bell
yeah,
curve.
yeah. Yes.
But for the most part, the average churchgoer in the middle is just as much affected by these cultural shifts as they are affecting those cultural shifts. And even those people who are in positions of authority and power within those cultural shifts, I think often are unknowingly supporting a cultural shift that is not healthy and is not appropriate. But if it gets the numbers up, then
Yeah.
the numerical increase seems to act as a buffer against any potential
Yeah.
criticism or any potential helpful criticism, some correction so that we can get things better.
Yeah.
One last thing before I let you go. You also mentioned in Reorganized Religion something that is dear to my heart, because the small church, big church thing is a big part of what I talk about and part of the way I minister. And a huge part of my ministry is to minister to and to resource small churches, but it's also to do so in a way that helps to build bridges between big and small. Because if all we're doing is talking about small churches among small church pastors, then we're just causing further division in the body of Christ, like we don't have enough division already. But you do directly deal with that in your book. Here's the quote from Reorganized Religion: "The sorting of people into either very large or very small congregations will have consequences for organized religion." What are the potential consequences for that?
Well, one of the consequences is that you're going to have a lot of small churches fail because there are just not enough people. If you have 60 people, so if the meeting church dropped from 130 to 60 people, that church of 60 people is still trying to do everything they did with 130, with fewer people, and everyone's exhausted. And that means half the congregations also are few of them. So if you got 30 people and they're all older, there's Ryan Burge, political scientist who studies religious statistics, and he's also a small church pastor. Put it perfectly that the abyss is right there, that you're going to fall off, that we're going to have a collapse of many, many churches. You also could have a collapse of very large churches because they're very weak institutionally, right? All the power is in the hands of a pastor. If that pastor fails, then it's like 30 or 40 or 50 churches failing. So that's one consequence of this. You're also losing the presence of churches. So small churches in particular are usually present in a community, often in a neighborhood. They're a viable presence. They're approachable. So in our neighborhood, for example, one of the churches has gift cards because they know if somebody runs out of gas, needs some groceries, they can meet that need. Not a long-term need for something, but a short-term need that really helps people from spiraling out of control. And they're pretty nimble to assist people. Well, that presence is going to go away because if those churches close, one, you'll never build them again. You'll never have that foothold in the neighborhood. And two, means that if people want to get to the church, they got to drive farther and farther. More resources. They got to have a car. They got to get more resources. And they're not close to the people they're ministering to. We're losing what sociologists call place-based community, where the community is within the place where people know their neighbors. We have moved in America towards network-based community, where I'm communing with people who are friends of mine, often online or on phone. They live in different places, but we are common interests keep us together, not placed together. Congregations are one place where your geography matters.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that small churches often that's really because you can't put a big church in the middle of a neighborhood. So if you
Yeah.
lose those small congregations, and those small congregations have staying power, we could lose both. Or we could end up with, instead of 300,000 churches, 30 or 40,000 churches in America, because all those little congregations will have collapsed. I mean, there's a fear that, a quarter of churches or more might close in the next 20 years, because if they're filled with old people, those old people are going to get older and they're going to die. This sounds terrible, right? And those the denominations that hold those churches, this is a whole different story, don't often think about how they see that as an asset to keep the denomination afloat versus an asset that could use to give into another ministry. So there's a whole like building, what happens to those buildings? I don't know if this is helpful to you or not, but one thing I'm really interested in your work is how do you resource and strengthen congregations? If I were a church leader, that would keep me up at night. How do you keep all these small churches alive long enough to adapt and grow, adapt to whatever the future is, so they can be intentional about what their future is? Because so many congregations have been reacting or ignoring what's going on there, that they've gotten to this point that they can't be proactive. Say, like, there's some really good renewal stuff going on in small churches. The Southern Baptists are doing it. Some of the Methodists are doing it. But it starts with an idea that what we have done is not working. But that doesn't mean the church has to end. It does mean that something new could happen. It means change. It means that we have to change what we do. And that the idea is that God isn't done with those churches, that they could do something new. But it takes someone saying, oh, I'm intentionally going to figure out what we're going to do, and give people hope, that because people won't change to something new unless they see it's better than what they have. And so I'm really excited to read your book, because I think that the strengthening and vitality of small churches is a really big issue that needs to be addressed.
You've said that in such a hopeful way. I don't know that I could add to it at all.
Right.
So just to encourage, those who are listening, pick up Bob's book, Reorganized Religion. It'll give you some challenging realities that we need to be facing. Follow it up with Ryan Burge's The Nuns, and with The Great Dechurching. These three books together, I think, are really important for today, just like John Dickerson's The Great Evangelical Recession was about, 15 years ago when that came out. You're dealing with very similar themes, and you're pointing out some very difficult realities, but offering some real hopefulness in the middle of that as well. And that's our hope, in this ministry, and for the new book coming out, for this podcast and everything else. We want to, one, encourage small churches that you have valid role to fulfill. Two, to give you small church specific resources, and at times to challenge our preconceptions, so that we're not just simply adding tools to a method that is no longer viable. We want to make sure that we are preaching the gospel as it has always been preached, but understanding that the way people hear that often needs a different language than the language we've been used to speaking it in. So thank you, Bob, so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Great to spend time with you.
I appreciate Bob's take on these subjects. It strikes me how different this week was from last week. Last week, we talked about Eugene Peterson with his biographer, Wynne Collier. And as I mentioned in the closing thoughts last week, one of the reasons Peterson did so much was how narrow his focus was. He ignored modern church trends and the cultural conversation. But on the other hand, Bob Smietana writes a great deal about those exact things. But Bob does them well, and he provides helpful information for many of us. So what's the lesson between Eugene Peterson on the one hand and Bob Smietana on the other? I think the lesson is there's no one single right way to approach ministry or the intersection of church and culture. As long as we're doing it from a Jesus-honoring place, they can all be helpful. Next week, I'll be talking with Scott McKnight. Scott is a well-known writer, thinker, and commentator on the church and the culture, and he brings a very positive take into this conversation. We'll be talking about forming a goodness culture in the local church. And don't forget that my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next, is now available wherever you buy books, either electronically or in print. If you're interested in having me come to speak to your group about any of the issues that I raise in this book, you can reach out to me at carlvaders.com/contact me. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaders. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Carl Vaders, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.